Running a manor. Most country people lived on a manor, which consisted of a village, the lord's house or castle, a church, and the surrounding farmland. The lord of the manor governed the community and appointed officials who made sure that the villagers carried out their duties. These involved farming the domain or lord's land and paying rents in the form of produce. The lord also acted as a judge in the manor court and had the power to fine those who broke the law. Since manors were often isolated, the villagers had to produce everything they needed themselves. Few goods, except salt for curing meat and iron for tools, came from outside. The only visitors were peddlers, pilgrims, or soldiers, and few people ever traveled far from their own village. Other duties. The lord was first and foremost a knight, page 8, who provided men to fight for the king whenever he needed them. These knights are receiving their swords. Medieval watering pot. The steward. The lord left the daily running of his manor to a number of officials. The most important was the steward, who organized farm work, kept accounts of the estate's money, and presided at the manor court if his master was away. Stewards were well paid, powerful figures in the district. The lord and lady. The lord and lady of the manor had to oversee the running of the estate and their household, but they also had plenty of free time to pursue leisure activities. This French tapestry shows two angels holding a canopy over the heads of a noble and his lady, perhaps symbolizing their charmed lives. The manor house. The lord and his family lived in a large house that was often built of stone. It was surrounded by gardens and stables and was protected by a high wall and sometimes by a moat. Apart from church activities, the manor house was a center of community life. Its great hall served as the manor court and as the venue for special village feasts such as those given after the harvest and at Christmas time. Happy hunting. Lords and ladies spent much of their time hunting, which was considered a noble pursuit. Many kept hawks to fly after rabbits or doves, and packs of hounds to chase deer or wild boar in their private woodlands. Favorite hawks were carried everywhere, even into church. Peak keeps the sun out of the eyes, and when reversed, allows rainwater to run off. Felt hat. Brown doublet or jacket. The bailiff. Next in importance to the steward was the bailiff. He was usually a peasant, which can be seen from his clothes. They were made from better material than those of a farm laborer, but were basically the same style. However, the bailiff was not a serf, page 10, but a freeholder who owned his own land. He was in charge of giving jobs to the peasants, looking after the domain's cattle, and taking care of repairs to buildings and tools, for which he hired skilled craftsmen such as carpenters and smiths. Going to the mill. In most communities, there was only one watermill, which was owned by the lord. All other mills were often outlawed, so that the villagers were forced to use his mill for grinding their grain into flour. As payment, the lord kept some of their grain. Villagers might also have to bake their bread in the lord's oven and use his winepress for their grapes, for which they paid similar fees. Woolen linen lined jacket with pewter buttons. Jacket was longer than that of a laborer. The reeve. The reeve was the bailiff's right-hand man. He was a peasant, chosen by other villagers, carrying a white stick as a badge of office. The reeve supervised work on the lord's domain, checking that everyone began on time and ensuring that none of the produce was stolen. Stirrups pulled the hose closer to the leg for a fashionably slender look. Leather boots. A medieval home. Medieval homes were very different from ours. Peasants spent most of the daylight hours outside, so the drafts and little light from their unglazed windows did not trouble them. Inside, they kept below the smoke of the fire by sitting on low stools. For lighting, they peeled field rushes and dipped them in fat, which burned like small candles. Everything was kept as clean as possible. The earthen floors were often worn hollow as a result of constant sweeping. Domestic life was much more communal than ours, with whole families eating, sleeping, and spending free time together in their one or two roomed houses. Page 11. The homes of the wealthy were much more elaborate. By the 13th century, some noblemen had a private family room called the solar. They paved their floors with decorated tiles and hung bright tapestries on their walls. Keeping warm. Medieval homes had hearths in the center of the room, away from wooden walls to avoid the risk of fire. By the 1400s, more people could afford stone chimneys, so fireplaces were more common. Window on the world. It was possible to judge the social status of a household by looking at its windows. The poor had small holes covered with wooden shutters that were closed at night or in cold weather. The better off might have fenestral windows, lattice frames covered in linen that had been soaked in resin and tallow. These let in light and kept out drafts and could be removed on fine days. Shutters are closed at night. Unwound horn. Central part is split and polished. Curly sheep's horn. Horn of plenty. Horn had been called the plastic of the Middle Ages because it was cheap and pliable. To make a horn window pane, the horn was first softened in water for 3 months, then unwound, split, and polished until it was transparent. The smallest room. By the late 15th century, many houses had an indoor toilet. It was little more than a closet in the wall with a hole over a cesspit. There probably would have been an outdoor toilet as well. Urinal. Urine was often saved to be used for cloth finishing and in dyeing processes. Wattle and daub wall, page 11. Some castle toilets empty directly into the moat. Glass substitute. In the Middle Ages, glass was rare and expensive, and only churches or royal palaces could afford glass windows. Noblemen and merchants often made do with windows made from panes of polished horn. These were cheaper and tougher than glass and let in lots of light, although they were difficult to see through. Horn panes are slotted into a wooden window frame. Rockabye baby. This noble baby's rocking cradle was probably the most comfortable bed in the house. However, babyhood was a dangerous time. More than 1/3 of the infants died, usually from disease. Cradle can be rocked by mother's foot while she sews or spins. Seats to suit. In most homes, people sat on plain stools or benches. Only a lord was likely to have a chair with a back and armrests, and he was thus called the chairman. Bedtime. A 15th century servant's book gives strict instructions on putting the lord to bed. After undressing him, combing his hair, and pulling on his nightcap, the servant should draw the curtains round about the bed, set there his nightlight, drive out the dog and cat, giving them a clout, take no leave of your lord, but bow low to him and retire. Canopy is attached to the ceiling. Hangings. Painted linen, woven tapestries, and fine wool cloths were hung from walls and doorways. They made rooms warmer by keeping out drafts and added brightness to dim interiors. This doorway and painted linen wall hanging come from the home of a wealthy merchant. White rose of the Virgin Mary. Many decorations bore religious symbols. Tester or canopy. Warm woolen curtains keep out drafts. Linen pillows stuffed with chopped straw. Linen sheets. Woven straw mattress. Truckle bed was wheeled out for children, servants, and others to sleep on. Woolen blanket. Keeping bugs at bay. Herbs such as lavender, tansy, and lady's bedstraw were strewn on straw mattresses. Their strong scents not only made the bed smell sweeter, but also kept away fleas. Lavender, tansy, lady's bedstraw. A room within a room. Wealthier people slept in beds made from strong timber beams, with a canopy overhead and curtains at the sides. The rich may have had feather-filled mattresses, but most were made of straw. When the curtains were drawn, the bed became a snug private space. This bed would have belonged to a bailiff, page 15, in the late 15th or early 16th century. From kitchen to table. People's diets in the Middle Ages varied according to their means. Rich noblemen and merchants could afford to eat a wide range of food, page 20, including expensive dried fruits, almonds, and spices from Asia. Although one poet believed the poor should live on nettles, reeds, briars, and pea shells, their diet was generally better than that. Ordinary people ate dark, coarse bread made from wheat mixed with rye or oatmeal, garden vegetables, and meat, especially pork, from their livestock. During the winter, they had to make do with meat and fish that had been preserved in salt, and cooks devised clever ways of masking the taste by adding oatmeal, peas, beans, or breadcrumbs to the pot. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk for dairy foods, which were known as white meats. Flesh hook for removing meat from a boiling cauldron. Small pot hanger. Adjustable ratchet. Large pot hook for a huge cauldron. Hooks for cooks. Most people boiled their food in iron pots that either hung from hooks over the fire or stood in the hot ashes. Once cooked, chunks of meat were pulled out of the pot with a flesh hook. Vegetables and grain were added to the leftover liquid to make a soupy pottage, which was a staple part of everyone's diet. This could be turned into thick pudding, called frumenty, by mixing it with wheat, crushed almonds, and egg yolks. Pot hook is suspended from an adjustable pot hanger to allow the cauldron to be raised or lowered into the fire. fast food. The church ordered that Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were fast days when no meat should be eaten. Fish was allowed and became a vital part of the diet. Ordinary people ate mainly salted or pickled herring, fresh eels, and shellfish. The wealthy could eat carp and pike from their fish ponds and a wide variety of river and sea fish. Three-legged cauldron can stand in the fire or hang from a pot hook. Firewood. Trivet or pot stand. Stone hearth. Head cook. In a peasant household, the wife prepared the family's food, simmering pottage on the fire and baking bread on a hot stone. In manor or castle kitchens, the head cooks were always men. They roasted, broiled, and baked vast quantities of food in great fireplaces and ovens. A small army of scullions or kitchen boys were responsible for the dishwashing. Conies or rabbits were a common source of fresh meat for ordinary people. A goose was often fattened for a special occasion. Wood pigeons could be wrapped in clay and baked in hot ashes. In the larder. Flush larders or pantries were hung with all kinds of birds and beasts. Besides mutton, beef, and pork, there was rabbit, duck, pigeon, venison, and wild boar. No bird was safe from the hunter. Everything from swans and herons to blackbirds was caught for the kitchen. Meat prepared on a chopping board. Fire dogs support the blazing logs. Fork and poker for tending fire. A handful of herbs. Flavoring herbs were widely used in the Middle Ages to give interesting taste to food that was often dull or salty. Vegetables such as turnips, leeks, onions, and cabbages were also known as pot herbs. Not regarded as food in their own right, they were thrown into the pot to fill out soups and stews. Mint, sage, rosemary, parsley. Kindling. Curfew, from the French couvre-le-feu, to cover the embers at night. On the hearth. Wattle and Daub peasant cottages, page 11, had no chimneys, so cooking was done on a simple stone hearth in the center of the room. Great castles and manor houses had much bigger fireplaces with huge stone chimneys where meat could be roasted on spits. The fires in the English King John's 1167 to 1216 kitchens were large enough to roast 2 whole oxen at the same time. Since they posed a serious fire hazard, kitchens were housed in separate buildings away from the main hall. High table, low table. Dinner was the grandest and biggest meal of the day. The lord of the manor sat with his most important guests at the high table raised on a dais or platform at one end of the great hall. From here, he could look down on the lesser diners and members of his household sitting at the low tables. A feast might have 3 courses of cooked meats and fish, elaborate roasts of swan, and peacocks reclothed in their skins, followed by numerous sweet and spicy dishes. All of these were quickly carried from the nearby kitchen so that they arrived piping hot. The lord was served first, after a sample of the food had been tasted by a servant to make sure it was not poisoned. Only then were the other diners served. Wooden bowl for pottage. Square pewter trencher base used as a personal chopping board. Personal knife engraved with owner's initials. Drinking vessel. Spoon was provided by the house. Get set. In the Middle Ages, table forks did not exist, but everyone used their own knife, a spoon, strips of bread, and their fingers to eat very politely, for table manners were important and formed part of every wealthy child's education. Entertaining in style. At the high table, the lord sat on a bench at the center with his back to the wall. Guests were seated in order of importance, starting with churchmen, then noblemen, then the lord's family. Servants scurried to and fro with meals, sauces, and jugs of wine from the buttery or bottlery. Singers and acrobats often entertained the diners between courses. The lord's seat at the center of the table. Expensive tiled floors. High table stood on a raised platform called a dais. Banquet bustle. The banqueting hall could be a crowded, noisy, smelly place. Tables were crammed with diners, and dogs crunched bones on the floor. Only the lord got a serving to himself. Other diners shared a bowl with up to 3 fellow guests. Most ate with their fingers, so it was important that these were clean and not used for blowing noses or scratching. Table etiquette was strict. If it happened that you cannot help scratching, one writer advised, then courteously take a portion of your dress and scratch with that. Large jug for ale. Leather tankard. Trestle table. Large wooden platter for serving bread or meat. Spoons were placed face down to keep out the devil. Horn mug. Hard wooden bench. Common fare. Diners seated at a low table would have eaten less elaborate food than that served up for the lord, but there were some common foods. Pottage, a thick broth of vegetables and meat stock, was a staple, everyday dish often served as a first course at feasts. Apart from pottage, everyone ate bread. All food was served on thick slices of stale bread called trenchers, and small loaves called matchets were used for mopping up gravy. Expensive wine glass, wooden drinking bowl, glazed ceramic drinking vessel, decorated ceramic jug for wine or ale, double salt for salt and mustard, dye cloth wall cover. Linen tablecloth was ironed while damp using round glass linen smoothers. Laid for a lord. The high table was carefully set out with a clean linen tablecloth, trencher bases, pottage and drinking bowls, salt, jugs, and if the household was wealthy, fine glasses. In the 15th century, a large communal napkin called the long towel was spread over the knees of the diners once they were seated. Medieval women. It is clear, wrote a French priest in 1386, that man is much nobler than women and of greater virtue. The medieval church looked on women as inferior to men and taught that they should be meek and obedient to their fathers and husbands. But the real lives of women in the Middle Ages were rather different. Not all of them stayed quietly at home. Most had to work for a living. Peasant women toiled alongside their husbands in the fields, as well as having to feed and clothe their families. The wives and daughters of craftsmen were often employed in the workshop and frequently operated as tradeswomen in their own right. Wealthy ladies organized large households and sometimes ran their husbands' affairs. However, only a few powerful abbesses, noblewomen, and queens had an influence on national events. Keep it covered. Although young single women often wore their hair loose, married women were expected to keep their hair covered in a linen wimple as a sign of modesty. The Maid of Orleans. Saint Joan, 1412 to 1431, was a French peasant's daughter who, at the age of 13, heard voices telling her to drive the invading English army out of France. Dressed in armor, she led the French troops to a great victory at the besieged town of Orleans. However, Joan was later betrayed and sold to the English, who burned her as a witch. Get thee to a nunnery. Many unmarried gentlewomen encountered convents and nunneries where they lived lives similar to those of monks, page 36 to 39. Nunneries offered women the opportunity to lead a devout life and also to obtain an education and take on responsibilities denied them in the outside world. As local landowners and employers, many abbesses were important figures in the community. Above. Holding the fort. This noblewoman has collapsed on hearing of her husband's death. Many women took on the responsibility of running large estates when their husbands died in battle or were away at court or on a crusade, page 28. They settled local disputes, managed the farms, and handled finances. Some women even fought battles defending their castles when they were under siege. Women of wealth. Landowners, male or female, were powerful figures in the medieval society, and an unmarried woman of property had equal legal rights with men. She could make a will and sign documents with her own seal. This 13th century seal belonged to a French noblewoman called Elizabeth of Savoy. However, when a woman married, she forfeited her land and rights to her husband. On his death, she was entitled to a third of his land with which to support herself. Spinsters. Spinning was done almost entirely by women using handheld spindles like this one. The spinning wheel was introduced from India in the 13th century. Many single women earned a living in this way, hence the term spinster for an unmarried woman. Wool twists into thread as the spindle twirls. Wrap-up. Most women covered their hair with white linen head wraps, but the wealthy wore gold nets over their coiled braids. The well-known pointed hat called the hennin was only popular for a short time in the late 15th century. Linen head wraps keeps hair clean as well as hidden. Decorated hairpins. Linen shift. Prayer beads. Pin on sleeves worn on Sundays and special occasions. The townswoman. A middle-class townswoman might have worn these clothes in the 15th century. In the towns, women worked in a variety of occupations. They might be shopkeepers, spinners, bakers, or alewives who brewed ale. Both married and unmarried women worked for a living. Because they were paid less than men, women often had 2 or more jobs. An early feminist. Christine de Pizan, 1364 to 1429, was one of the few medieval women to earn a living by writing. She wrote poetry and books protesting the way women were both glorified and insulted by male authors. Leather purse serves as a pocket. Leather garters hold up stockings. Woolen over-the-knee stockings. Wooden pattens worn over shoes when muddy. Buckled leather shoes with thin soles. Woolen kirtle fits close around the upper body. Fairs and feast days. Both peasants and town dwellers look forward to the festivals and fairs that mark the important days of the year. On holy days, or holidays such as Christmas and Easter, everyone took time off work to attend special church services, banquets, and festivities. Great trade fairs, often held on the feast days of saints, were also occasions for fun. Merchants came from all over Europe to buy and sell their goods and were entertained by musicians, acrobats, and players. Other special events that were related to different times of the year were May Day, Midsummer's Eve, and the Harvest Home. No dice. Although it was frowned upon by the church, gambling was one of the most widespread of medieval pastimes. People played dice games and betted on wrestling matches, cockfights, and bear baiting. Yuletide Fools. One of the highlights of Christmas was the Feast of Fools. A bishop was chosen and dressed up in mock vestments. He led everyone into church and recited services in gibberish. Meanwhile, others played dice on the altar and sang rude songs. Balancing act. Acrobats, jugglers, and dancing bears were all popular forms of entertainment at medieval festivals. The Great Fairs. Fairs often grew out of religious festivals. After Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris acquired a piece of Christ's true cross in 1109, thousands of pilgrims came to visit this holy relic, page 42, each June. Merchants set up their stalls in the surrounding streets, and soon the fair had grown into a major event. The Bishop of Paris is seen here bestowing a blessing on the proceedings. Fair chews. There was plenty of food for sale at fairs and markets. Simple baked or deep-fried meat pies like these chewits were the most common fare. Out on the town. Many people came to fairs simply to have a good time, and tavern keepers did a roaring trade. Large amounts of cheap ale and wine were consumed, and drunkenness was common. In this Italian tavern, fresh quantities of wine are being passed up from the cellar to supply the carousing merchants. At the market. Besides the great fairs, there were weekly markets in most big towns. Peddlers, merchants, drovers of cattle, sheep, pigs, and even geese all came. Stalls sold a huge array of goods, from cheese, eggs, and salt to pots and pans, tools, knives, shoes, and cloth. This reconstructed medieval market stall contains leather goods that would have been on sale at markets in the 14th and 15th centuries. Canvas cover. New patterns, page 23 for sale. Leather costrel, page 11. Leather tankards. Colored goatskin for making shoes. Large roll of cattle hide. Wooden frame can be easily folded up for transporting the stall. Old shoes waiting to be mended. Leftover leather from cut-out shoe patterns. Leather bottles. Wooden shoe lasts for shoemaking. Medieval music. In the Middle Ages, most people heard music in church. In the echoing spaces of the great cathedrals, monks and priests recited their texts by chanting them in a single key. This lovely form of singing was known as plain chant or plain song. Few cathedrals had organs, and church singing was usually unaccompanied by musical instruments, but kings and noblemen often dined to the sound of harps and lutes played by poet-musicians called troubadours, page 26. On feast days, ordinary people sang folk songs and danced to pipes and drums, and by 1400, most towns had a town band of professional musicians who accompanied processions with shawms, page 58, and trumpets. Barefoot. Some musicians trained bears to dance and tumble to the music of the pipe and tabor. Bears were usually because they could walk on 2 feet in a human way. A medieval drum kit. Many musical instruments were brought to Europe by returning crusaders. These nakers, or small drums, left were modeled on the Middle Eastern nakara, a kind of kettle drum with a curved body. Nakers were hung in pairs on a belt and usually played to accompany dance music. Naker player. Turning the handle operates the instrument. The turning wheel plays the strings. Hurdy-gurdy player. Fine fiddle. Most troubadours in the 13th century France accompanied themselves on a fiddle. It was bigger than the modern violin and often rested in the lap. Only one string of this fiddle could be altered on the fingerboard. The other 4 were fixed strings that sounded a continuous bass tone or drone. Symphony of sound. Monks in the 11th century Spain used an organistrum to teach singing in their choir schools. This was a stringed instrument that needed two people to operate. One turned the handle while the other played the keys. The organistrum developed into the hurdy-gurdy, which could be played by one man. It could mingle several sounds together, so it came to be known as the symphony. Wheel cover. One-man band. The smallest of all dance bands was the pipe and tabor. The pipe had only 3 holes, and the musician could easily play it with his left hand while hitting the tabor with his right. These simple instruments were commonly used to accompany village dances. Drumstick, pipe, snare adds a buzz to the sound of the tabor. Bagpipe player, sound comes out through the pipes. The strings are plucked with goose quills. Heavenly music. In medieval paintings, angels were often shown playing the psaltery, similar to a small harp. It often formed part of a small orchestra with other soft-tone instruments such as the lute, viol, and flute. Page 44. Musician blows into mouthpiece to inflate the bag. Pegs can be tightened to tune the strings. Outside strings are bass strings or drones. Keys operate the 2 inside strings. Keys fall back into place by gravity. Bagpipes. Contrary to legend, bagpipes were not invented by the Scots. In fact, in about 1300 they were being played in many parts of the world, including England, India, and North Africa. Bag is made of leather. Pipe is played with fingers. Plays and parades. Medieval drama was started by the church. Sometime in the 11th century, priests began to add short scenes to the major religious services, such as those at Christmas and Easter. The scenes portrayed the great moments in the Bible: the fall of Adam, Noah escaping the flood, or Samson destroying the temple. People loved this new kind of entertainment. The scenes became so popular that they were performed in church porches, then on stages in town marketplaces, where more people could see them. By the 13th century, they had become complete cycles of plays, telling the whole Christian story and lasting as long as 40 days. In England, France, Italy, and Germany, they were staged by the local guilds. Page 50. They became known as mystery plays from the French word métier, or trade. Masks and mummers. Horses' heads, devil masks, drums, bells, and dances all played their part in a performance put on by mummers above. On special occasions, mummers or masked actors staged short plays or mimes that told simple folk tales, usually featuring dramatic sword fights and a doctor who would enter at the end of the story and bring the dead back to life. Festival fanfare. The shawm was a reed instrument with a loud, piercing sound that was played at town parades and festivals. Wild green men. Many pagan, non-Christian rituals lived on in medieval Europe. Bands of woodwoos, or wild woodmen dressed in leaves and greenery, would rush into feasts and pageants, causing havoc. Their dances symbolized the untamed forces of nature. On the occasions shown above, their costumes accidentally caught fire from a candle. Funny face. In 1230, a priest complained of actors who changed and distort their bodies with shameful leaps and gestures. The stone carving shows a fool or jester literally pulling a face to amuse his audience. Fools also entertain people by telling rude jokes and waving a pig's bladder filled with dried peas. The dragon can be made to breathe fire and smoke by exploding small amounts of gunpowder inside its head. Playing the devil. Like church carvings and stained glass windows, page 34, mystery plays were a good way of teaching Bible stories to ordinary people who could not read and write. In this scene, the devil is seen tempting Jesus in the wilderness. Each section of a mystery play was mounted on a wagon and drawn to a series of stations throughout the town. If spectators waited long enough in one spot, they would see the whole cycle of plays. Carved wooden head decorated with bright paint. Snapdragon. This wooden head belonged to a parade dragon that was used in processions to celebrate the feast days of St. George in the town of Norwich, England. It was operated by a man hidden inside the basket work body and caused great amusement by snapping at the people who lined the streets. Dragons also played an important part in many mummers' plays, where they were usually shown battling with the valiant St. George. Lower jaw can be pulled up to make a snapping noise. The back of the dragon's head was fitted with a long wooden pole, which was used for maneuvering the head.